September 11, 2001, 8:46 a.m. A plane suddenly changes course over New York City, and just seconds later, it crashes into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. In an instant, thousands of lives are changed forever. But inside that very building, there was a man who may have understood this attack long before most of the world ever could. He wasn't an ordinary FBI agent. For more than a decade, he had been tracking one of the most dangerous terrorist networks on Earth. He had repeatedly warned that Al-Qaeda would eventually strike on American soil. He had also come to understand that New York, and especially the World Trade Center, could become a target again. But the most painful irony in this story is this. Just 19 days before the attack, that man had left the FBI, and he had taken a job as the head of security at the very building he had spent years warning America about. His name was John O'Neill. But this isn't simply the story of an FBI agent who died on 9/11. It's the story of intelligence that already existed, names that were already inside the system, warnings that had been issued again and again, and a man who recognized the threat but was never given all the information he needed to stop it. John O'Neill's journey didn't begin like a Hollywood hero story. In Atlantic City, during the early 1960s, a young boy grew up falling asleep to the sounds of a police scanner. He was fascinated by the FBI. He wanted to understand how crimes happened and how the people who stopped them thought, but he wasn't old enough to become an FBI agent yet. So he started at the bottom, a fingerprint clerk, then an FBI building tour guide. And while doing that, he memorized the corridors of the building he dreamed of one day working inside. By 1976, he was wearing an FBI badge, and from there, his career began moving fast. Organized crime, white-collar crime, counterintelligence, and eventually terrorism. But O'Neill's greatest strength wasn't simply that he worked hard. He saw patterns. Where other officials saw separate incidents, he saw different pieces of the same story. In February 1995, he got the opportunity that would change his life. Ramzi Youssef, the man behind the 1993 World Trade Center bomb, had been spotted in Pakistan. O'Neill took charge of the operation. He coordinated multiple agencies, and within 3 days, Youssef was in custody. But for O'Neill, the case didn't end with the arrest.
It was only the beginning, because his question wasn't simply, who is the terrorist? His question was, who is behind the terrorist? And as he began digging deeper into the 1993 attack, one name kept appearing: Osama bin Laden. Slowly, O'Neill began to understand that America wasn't fighting a single terrorist. It was facing a network spread across multiple countries with ambitions that went far beyond overseas targets. Then came 1996, the Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia. 19 Americans were killed. Hundreds were wounded. O'Neill traveled there to investigate, but once again, the same problem appeared. The harder he pushed the investigation, the more political barriers appeared in front of him. Local resistance, diplomatic pressure, and conflicts between agencies. To O'Neill, this wasn't just one investigation. It was a pattern. Every time the threat grew, the politics grew with it. Then came 1996. The U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were bombed. 224 people were killed. By then, O'Neill was almost certain that the network behind these attacks was also a threat to the United States itself. And then, at the end of 1999, a man named Ahmed Rassam was arrested while trying to enter the United States from Canada. His car contained explosives.
The arrest pointed toward a much larger terrorist network. America went on alert. Agencies began sharing information, and O'Neill put his team into a round-the-clock posture. He feared that terrorist cells could already be inside the United States. His fear wasn't just a guess. It was the conclusion of years of investigation. But there was a problem. The more clearly O'Neill saw the threat, the more divided the system became. America had the FBI. It had the CIA. And both were looking at the same enemy, but they lived in different worlds. The CIA gathered intelligence overseas. The FBI enforced the law inside the United States. And between between them. There was a wall, a bureaucratic barrier that could prevent information from moving from one agency to the other. That wall would soon become one of the most consequential failures in American intelligence history. Now, remember two names, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. At the beginning of 2000, the CIA already had information about them. A meeting in Kuala Lumpur had been monitored, photographs had been taken, people had been identified, and among those people were Mihdhar and Hazmi. But there was another critical piece of information. Mihdhar had a valid U.S. visa. That meant he could legally enter the United States. Under normal procedures, that should have triggered action. His name could have been placed on a watch list. The FBI could have been notified. U.S. authorities could have been alerted. But that didn't happen. January 15th, 2000, Mihdhar entered the United States. Hazmi entered as well. Both used their real names, and for nearly the next 20 months, they remained inside America. They lived in San Diego. They rented rooms. They took flight lessons, and slowly, they moved closer to preparing for an attack that the world would eventually know as 9/11. But at the time, John O'Neill had no idea they existed. Why? Because the CIA had the information, but it never reached O'Neill, and that is where the biggest question in this story begins. If the FBI's most aggressive counterterrorism investigator had received their names, what would have happened? Could he have found them? Could they have been placed under surveillance? Could they have been arrested? Or would history have unfolded exactly the same way? There is no certain answer, but one thing is clear. O'Neill never got the chance to find out. And according to former FBI officials, this wasn't simply an ordinary communication failure. Attempts to share the information were reportedly blocked. FBI agents Mark Rossini and Doug Miller were working within the CIA's counterterrorism world. They learned about Mihdhar's U.S. visa. An attempt was made to send the information to FBI headquarters, but the effort was stopped. The names remained inside files, inside rooms, and behind bureaucratic walls. Later, there was disagreement over how much information the CIA had actually shared with the FBI and when it had been shared. But the 9/11 Commission did not find sufficient records supporting claims that the critical information had reached the FBI in time. And while all of this was happening, O'Neill kept fighting. He traveled to Yemen to investigate the bombing of the USS Cole. October 12, 2000, a small boat approaches the USS Cole. Seconds later, a massive explosion tears through the ship. 17 American sailors are killed. 39 are wounded. And the U.S. Navy destroyer is nearly sunk. O'Neill immediately travels to Yemen. He arrives with hundreds of agents and specialists. He wants evidence. He wants access to witnesses. He wants to identify the entire network behind the attack. But once again, he runs into the same problem. Diplomacy versus investigation. American officials versus Yemeni officials. And O'Neill caught in the middle. His approach was aggressive, but there was a reason for that aggression. He believed another attack could happen at any moment. He was right, but the system wasn't moving at his speed. Eventually, his ability to return to Yemen became restricted, and that became another major turning point in his career. Now he wasn't only fighting terrorists, he was fighting politics inside his own institution. Back in Washington, his career was also being weakened. He was passed over for major promotions. People began describing him as too aggressive, too confrontational, too political. Then another incident happened. During a conference, his briefcase disappeared. Inside were classified documents that he should not have been carrying. The briefcase was later recovered. The documents were still there, but the incident was used against him. His personal life was complicated too. He had a marriage, he had relationships, he had personal weaknesses, and slowly the story shifted away from terrorism and toward O'Neill himself. It's one of the easiest ways to undermine a warning. If you can make the person delivering the message look unreliable, you don't have to listen to the message. By the summer of 2001, O'Neill was exhausted. He was also under financial pressure, and his future inside the FBI didn't look the way it once had. Then, in August 2001, he made the decision to leave the FBI. 31 years, an entire career given to the Bureau. And then he walked away. The very next day, he began working as the head of security at the World Trade Center. Think about the irony. The same building a attacked in 1993 was now under the protection of the man who had spent years hunting the terrorist network that had emerged from that attack. But the real irony was still coming. The same day O'Neill started his new job, intelligence connected to Midar and Hazmi finally began moving toward the FBI. The search for the two men inside the United States began, but it was already too late.
The information moved slowly. Jurisdictions became confused, and the same wall was still standing in the way. Meanwhile, O'Neill was learning the World Trade Center, the stairwells, the radios, the cameras, the evacuation routes. He was trying to protect the very building he had warned about years earlier. Then September arrived. On the night of September 10th, O'Neill was out with friends in New York. For once, he seemed happy with his new life. A new job, a better salary, less financial pressure, and perhaps for the first time, it looked like his life might finally become normal. But the next morning, everything would change. September 11, 2001, 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashes into the North Tower. Inside the building, fire spreads. Smoke fills the corridors. People run, and O'Neill manages to get out. He makes the call. He's alive, but he doesn't simply stand outside and wait. He goes back inside. He tries to help people. He tries to understand what is happening. He begins
functioning like an improvised command center. He does what he has done his entire career. He tries to create order inside chaos. Then, 9:03 a.m., another plane hits the South Tower. Now, this isn't just an attack, it's a war. O'Neill understands that the network he has spent years chasing
has finally reached the heart of America. But he doesn't know that within minutes, his own life will be over. The South Tower collapses, then the North Tower, and within minutes, the New York skyline is transformed. John O'Neill never makes it home. His remains are recovered days later. He is 49 years old. A man who recognized the direction of the threat years earlier. A man who warned again and again. A man who devoted his career to understanding Al-Qaeda. And in the end, he died inside the very building he had accepted his final job to protect. But the story doesn't end there. Because after 9/11, when America looked back, questions began to emerge. Information about Midar and Hazmi already existed. Information about Midar's U.S. visa existed. Information about their travel existed. Warning signs existed. But one thing was missing: timely action. And perhaps that is the most frightening part of the entire story. History doesn't always change because of one enormous mistake. Sometimes small mistakes pile on top of one another. One piece of information isn't shared. One report gets stopped. One official can't reach another. One promotion is denied. One investigation hits a political wall. And then, one day, all those small failures become a catastrophe. The entire world watches unfold. John O'Neill was right, but being right wasn't enough. He had the determination. He had the experience. He had the context. And he had the ability to recognize the threat. But he didn't have all the information he needed to act. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson in this story. Threats aren't always invisible. Sometimes the threat is right there. The names exist. The photographs exist. The visa exists. The warnings exist. But when different parts of a system fail to communicate, the truth can remain invisible, even when all the information is sitting right in front of them. John O'Neill didn't defeat terrorism, but he tried to understand it before many others did. He warned about the storm long before it arrived, and when that storm finally came, O'Neill was standing inside the very building he had spent years warning people about. He found a way out. He survived the initial impact. He could have stayed outside, but he went back in, and perhaps that final decision captures his entire life in a single image. A man who spent his career moving toward danger to protect other people, and on his final day, he did exactly the same thing. The system couldn't stop him. The terrorists didn't stop him first, but eventually, the threat he had spent years identifying came for him too. John O'Neill's story isn't just a story about 9/11.
9/11. It's a story about what happens when an institution has plenty of information, but no one is able to connect it in time, because the most dangerous failure in history isn't always
Having the wrong information. Sometimes the most dangerous failure is having the right information and getting it too late.